Hello everyone and welcome back to a new video in WARNO about tanks, and today we're gonna compare NATO and Pact tanks and how they compare to each other, where the strengths and weaknesses lies, why it does feel like Pact tanks are better even though that isn't really true, and how to use them to get more out of them on the battlefield. And we're gonna go into a lot of numbers. I made a big Excel spreadsheet with all the tanks in there and all their stats. So let's get that party started. And we're gonna start with the direct comparison of all tanks. That includes all mainline battle tanks categorized in the game by that, without CV tanks and without the direct fire HE tanks like the EBG or the ISU 152. So even stuff like the MX-13 or the T-34 are in this. We're gonna go afterwards into the light, medium, and heavy category with T-34s, MX-13s, and the light MX-10 or ML-90 being cut out, which I categorized as very light, and have a look between those. But let's start with just a general comparison here. And there, on the first look, Pact has a massive advantage. Because if you look at the raw direct stats, like frontal armor and penetration, Pact has an advantage. It has, on average, more penetration with 16 calculated up to 2275 meter range. It has 13 frontal armor on average versus the 10.1 of NATO. In median, it's even higher, 14.5 versus 10. And the median of the penetration is 0.5 higher as well. Side armor is 1 higher. So if you just look at that, Pact feels OP. But that's way too on the surface. Because if we go one step deeper and we start looking at accuracy, range, and speed, then NATO starts to have slight advantages, as NATO on average has a slightly higher range, 2120 versus 2083. It has slightly more accuracy when static, 55% versus 53.3%, so 2% advantage on accuracy on average there. On motion, it's lower, but that's mostly because the French don't have stabilizers. It's there 28 versus 39% for Pact. If you would calculate out the French, it would be pretty equal, or even slightly higher for NATO there as well. Rate of fire, NATO has a slight advantage of 0.7 rounds per minute as well, and this is before you calculate in veterancy, and that Pact tanks with autoloaders don't get an advantage there, but they don't get a disadvantage from stress, so I ignored that in this. This is all at 0 vet. Speed, NATO has a 6 km/h off-road speed advantage as well. So NATO has the soft values for the most part. And then another massive soft value that comes in NATO's favor is smoke. 95.8% of NATO tanks have smoke. That means only 2 tanks don't have smoke. Or 3 tanks, actually, don't have smoke. On the other side, it's 63.46% that have smoke, so 1/3 of Pact tanks don't have smoke. And that's a massive disadvantage in this game. Smoke is so powerful, so that is pretty big. And then you also have to calculate in that the average NATO tank is cheaper. 129 points on average versus 156 points on average, meaning that all the stats we saw before are kind of screwed up that way as well, because if you calculate them based on cost efficiency, NATO would get better in all those stats a bit as well, meaning that the penetration would be somewhat equal, the accuracy and all of those stats where it's already better would get a bit better as well, and the frontal armor advantage would still be on Pact side, but a bit lower there as well. So in the end, Pact has the armor advantage, and then it has gun-launched ATGMs. There are only 3 tanks now with the MX-13-75 that have ATGM on NATO side with the Sheridan and the MX-13s, and then there are quite a lot on Pact side, so that is something that also puts up the price a bit. So that's why I went with those raw stats. So in general, NATO has to focus on those sideline stuff, like using the speed advantage, like using the rate of fire advantage to get the second shot out first, faster, and then maybe stop the engagement there, like the range advantage, cutting off the enemy there, and so on. Whilst Pact has the raw power. Pact can go in, and that makes Pact tanks easier to use on average in direct engagements, and just go in there with the frontal armor, take a couple of shots, win the fights. If you go head on 1 by 1 with a NATO tank versus a Pact tank, on average, the Pact tank likely will win because those raw power stats are better. If you use the speed to get the engagements at the right moment, to get a side shot, to and use the accuracy to maybe get that more reliant shot out first and so on, get veterancy up, which is a multiplier, so if you have an advantage there in those stats, it already also gets better. The other stats not getting to use those at all, so all of that really can be helpful for NATO. And yeah, this is where it comes in. So this is the baseline. Let's have a look into the different categories, starting with heavies and super heavies. And when we look at super heavy and heavy tanks, which are for NATO side, the Leo 2 family, the Challengers, and the 120mm gun Abrams, versus the Pact ones, which are the T80 family, T64Bs, and the T72B/S, and the Wilk. The picture is turned around. NATO has the raw stats. Penetration is a bit better on average. You have better frontal armor there. And they also still have a lot of advantages in the other stuff. They have better average gun range, better accuracy on the main gun, better speed. They lose a bit out on rate of fire because the Challengers drag them down. And the autoloader on the other side is in there, but even there, with the 8-gun T72, 8 rounds per minute T72s, that's somewhat equal there, and with the veterancy you can get it up. And Pact kinda has to rely on the ATGMs out of the main guns. Like, this is why this is so NATO favored, and the price actually doesn't really show that. Like, this price is kinda close on average between these two. So the two advantages that the heavy tanks on Pact have are the ATGMs. Quite a lot of them have gun-launched ATGMs, and none of the NATO ones have. So you have to use that as a rate advantage to start to equalize the fight there. And they have better HE firepower by a lot. The main guns already have higher HE DPS, and they have more MGs, especially because Challengers and Leos fall flat there, and there's a heavy MG on every of the Pact tanks, so you get a lot more HE firepower out of those tanks, helping out a good bit there, equalizing the score, and that is how you get the advantage there a bit. But when it comes to raw tank fighting, NATO has the advantage in the heavy and super heavy ones, and if you can get into gun range, they just kind of dominate there. So with the higher speed and so on, you can also chase the enemy. Like, all of this is really important and makes life for Pact tanks in gun range there a good bit harder. So this really shows you it is not that black and white. The category there dominated by NATO. Let's get on to a category where it is a bit more Pact favored. And that is the medium gun territory. And that's not really based on stats, though the classic raw stats there are a bit better for Pact once more, with penetration and armor. But the big thing is here, there are a good couple more medium tanks on Pact side, with the T72 family, the T64Rs, Ace, the T62s, which all fall into this category of like 140 to 210 point tanks, and also having quite a lot of those like heavier armor, but medium, like range 15 or 14 to 17. And then on the NATO side, you only have a couple of mediums. You only have the Chieftains and the 105mm Abrams, and that is not a lot of tanks. So that's really where the main advantage in the medium category for Pact is how many more of those you get, and how many decks you get them. But the stats also are something worth looking at, as once more you have an advantage there in penetration and frontal armor for Pact, though it's slight, and NATO has still the range advantage, has the accuracy advantage here by a good bit. Rate of fire is equal, because the chieftains are not good at rate of fire, but neither are the T-72s. And the T-62s are absolutely terrible, so that equalizes the score there a bit. And then we have the price, where they are pretty equal as well. So that's all quite fair and square, but really the number of medium tanks is one massive thing that Pact has, and this is why it feels a bit oppressive in team games, I would say, because you see that many tanks coming around. But what you have to remember is that NATO has way better tools against this than Pact has outside of the tank depth. Because NATO has Milan 2s and TOW 2s and other hard-hitting ATGMs in every single deck, which can deal good damage to these medium tanks with a hit. Pact, on the other side, has the Conquerors usually at best in every deck, and not even that in all of the decks. Sometimes it ends at a Bastion or a Malutka even, and a Fagot, so that you don't even have 20 pen missiles in your decks, which against those averages of 14 frontal armor, 15 frontal armor, do a lot less damage. And that means that the Pact tanks have a harder time surviving against the support, but against the main battle line, in the main battles, they have an advantage because you have that many of them. They can trade up against heavy tanks easier than the light category can. They can help out really well against the light tanks and so on. So this is why Pact feels OP in team games, together with the gun-launched ATGMs, which on the open fields, if you just run into them, they will be able to do some good damage and slow you down. But if you get into the usage of your support weapons as NATO, with using your ATGM advantage in penetration, that can turn around quite quickly. And this is going to be always an interesting footing here, which really shows that I don't think there's a stronger faction right now in the game, and you really just have to see where the strengths and weaknesses of the two factions are and use those wisely. And yeah, with that, let's have a look on the light tank category. And in the light tank category, I would say NATO has a pretty nice advantage. They have the penetration advantage here, because Leo 1 family, the MX-30s, and so on, against T-54s and T-55s on the other side, which just don't quite have the pen to get through heavier stuff that easily. Like, that's a pretty key feature of all of this. And the range is relatively close on average, but still a NATO favorite, 2086 versus 2034 meters on average. The frontal armor there, the Pact wins out once more, but NATO here has the biggest advantage in smoke, as all of their tanks here have smoke, basically, outside of a couple of M47s. And on the other side, we have nearly half of them without smoke, and that makes them so much more vulnerable to ATGMs, and also means that when on the field, they can't disengage. So you have to use them out of forest most of the time as Pact, so that they can get back into cover, or you have to risk it if you cross a field and really have enough mass to go around, whilst NATO can move a bit easier around and then smoke off when things are getting troubled. And the rate of fire advantage here is big as well. 9.12 average rate of fire on the NATO side versus 7.75 average on Pact side, median 9 versus 8. So the rate of fire there is big for NATO, meaning that if you go into a gunfight where you can't finish it with the second shot fired, you have a massive advantage here, because your second round will come out faster, a lot quicker, and then usually after 2 shots, a couple of enemy die, so the damage calculation for the third shot goes into your favor, or maybe everything is dead already on the other side and they only got one shot out against your two shots, and you have a big advantage there. So the rate of fire here is big in these light tank engagements for NATO. Speed is there still as well, so they can maneuver more around. HE, once more, a bit on the side of Pact because they have a lot of MGs on their stuff, but the main guns here actually not doing that well, and NATO on this side also has the MX-30s, which have a lot of HE firepower as well, so this is where NATO, in my eyes, has the biggest advantage, the light tanks. And this is where, in team games, it might be the hardest to use them, because if you have, especially in big 10v10s, a lot of the super heavies coming around, light tanks don't trade up well against that, and you have to figure out a way of how to use them. The best way to use them is maybe using them as hunters against IFVs, shooting those down quickly, and as support on the side, and then maybe flanking. But as you have an advantage in the super heavy category, as NATO, if you don't go over the super open fields where gun launch ATGMs can dominate, you have a lot of stuff to work out here. So yeah, the medium tank category is a problem. T-72s are a problem for Leo 1s and so on, but that's where your ATGM advantage comes in. And this is really what you have to play around here if you want to use these divisions wisely and the units wisely that you have as NATO and Pact. And in general, I think it's a pretty balanced field at the moment. It was at times when the T-72s were just way too cost efficient, heavily favored towards Pact in my eyes, but this has changed quite a bit, and in team games and 1v1. Currently, with T-55 nerfs and so on lately, I think the time for NATO light tank is here right now. Their light tanks haven't been nerfed as heavily at all, and their heavies are really, really good as well. The Leo 2s are absolutely wild right now, especially the Dutch ones, but German ones are good as well, and I think the balance currently is in a really, really good space. You just have to remember that it's not all just frontal armor and penetration, and you have to look a bit deeper and figure out how to use those side stats, like accuracy, like rate of fire, like speed, to your advantage. So I hope this was informative and helpful. Let me know down below what you think. If you have any further questions, any feedback, leave that down there as well. And see you all in the next